Welcome to online lecture 5B here in Biology 140. Guys, I hope you're doing well today. We're going to be going into the Chapter 5 PowerPoint slides 29 all the way to the end. So we're going to go 29 to about 50. And our topic is on the aquatic ecosystems. We'll be looking at the marine ecosystems, which marine means, of course, saltwater. And then we'll get into the freshwater ecosystems and discuss, of course, their biological productivity, biodiversity, and then we'll talk about human impacts on these aquatic ecosystems. Of course, we will be in the review sheet as well. We'll be covering large portions of this review sheet, so kind of pulling that up, guys, you could see we'll be looking at the basically numbers 4, so we'll definitely get into number 4, the marine ecosystems. We'll move all the way on down through number 5, 6, 7, 8. We'll talk about the differences between swamps, marshes, bogs, and fens. A lot of people don't even know what some of these things are. And so I think you're going to definitely learn some new things. A lot of these vocabulary words in here about different aquatic ecosystems I think will be enlightening. And then, of course, we'll look at human impacts towards the end. We'll even discuss some of the human impacts on terrestrial biomes at the end. So we'll be hitting all these review sheet items, and then of course we'll be getting into the lab. So we'll discuss the lab here, which is the Biome Survival Lab. It's actually found on a website where you are going to crash. Yes, you're going to go into a horrible plane crash, and you're going to try to survive in a biome of your choosing. So we'll discuss the Biome Survival Lab. We'll actually click on that link. I'll take you there and show you where the questions are and what kinds of things you ought to be thinking about as you survive. And of course, you can actually work in groups, small groups if you like. If you happen to know someone from the class, it's fine if you'd like to work in groups of no more than 4, but most of you will probably do this solo. I know a lot of y'all don't even live even here in Morganton. You may even live several hours away. So I understand if you want to go solo. But good thing about this lab, everyone will survive. All right, we're all going to survive, so no worries. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get in this slide. This slide, I believe it was 29, marine ecosystems. So we're talking about these saltwater ecosystems, which cover 3/4 of Earth's surface. A little bit less than that, but just about 3/4. That's amazing. So naturally, with all that water, you expect to have lots of biodiversity. Of course, we have that, not just because of the abundance of water. I mean, that's what defines it, but also because it's just such a large area, such an extensive area with a lot of different conditions. The big thing about marine ecosystems and aquatic ecosystems is issues of sunlight and temperature, which vary greatly in a vertical sense. So we're going to see that as we go through. So photosynthesis, even here in the marine ecosystems, is going to be very important, and your primary productivity is primarily based on photosynthesis. So just like the terrestrial ecosystems, so the marine ecosystems are heavily based on photosynthesis, giving us that primary productivity and our major source of biomass. So photosynthesis, of course, then will be carried out more by algae. Y'all know algae are still sort of classified as protists, although that's changing. But there's also free-floating plants. So we have algae like brown algae, red algae, green algae, and then we also have the free-floating plants. Examples of brown algae, guys, that would be like things like kelp. A lot of our seaweeds are brown algae. You'll see the red algae include a lot of things like nori, like for your nori wraps, like the red algae are wrapped around your sushi wraps. And then green algae, just kind of self-explanatory. They typically have a greenish color, and they are often found floating at the top. And yes, there are free-floating plants. Some of them are very small, and that whole community is called phytoplankton. So the phytoplankton are organisms that float near the surface of the ocean and also perform photosynthesis. The greatest amount of photosynthesis, of course, would occur near the surface and even more, not just the surface of the ocean in general, but near the coasts. And why? Well, remember the coastal areas is where our nutrients wash in. And what nutrients would those be? Can you remember? Yeah, those key nutrients, things like phosphorus, things like nitrogen, things even like potassium, but particularly things like nitrogen and phosphorus will be coming in. Those are typically the limiting nutrients when it comes to algal and plant growth. So near the coast, you'll see a lot of that. But not only that, it's not just where the nutrients are, it's also where, of course, there's a lot of light because it's shallower near the coast, right? All right, so that's a major area of productivity. The other area of productivity is deeper. These organisms, they die and they fall to the sea floor. And then these nutrients from these organisms, as they fall down, their nutrients are carried down into the deep ocean ecosystems. So we have this thing called marine snow. And the marine snow is like manna. It's like food coming down from the heavens, if you will, coming from the upper layers and going down to those lower layers. So we have this constant flow of nutrients in the form of dead organisms going down towards the bottom of the ocean. And then we also have upwelling currents coming from the bottom. So upwelling currents, they help circulate nutrients from the ocean floor back to the surface. There's an extensive upwelling in some areas. For example, off the coast of South America, in the area where we predict El Nino and La Nina events, weather events, right around there, close to the Galapagos Islands, we see tremendous upwelling occurring. And that brings up all these nutrients from the ocean floor back up to the surface. And just think of that combination, guys. You got nutrients like natural fertilizer coming up from the depths, encountering sunlight-rich, shallow areas of the ocean. You can imagine the tremendous productivity that occurs in these areas. So fisheries are incredible there, and fishermen, of course, know that, and they fish heavily in these areas. All right, this is a great map showing you areas of biological productivity. Try to interpret this for you. So let's focus on the water, okay? So don't worry about the land as much. Let's look at the water. So if you see a dark green or blue land areas, so mainly the dark green to blue land areas have high biological productivity, not just on the land, of course, in the ocean. So this is really high productivity here in the North Atlantic. You might be thinking, man, isn't the North Atlantic cold, Mr. Spath? Well, it's cold, but you know, cold water holds more oxygen. So warmer water holds less oxygen. So we have lots of oxygen here in the North Atlantic since it is colder. We have, you know, a fairly good number of nutrients coming off these continents, Europe and North America. So productivity is really high here. Notice it's very high along the coast of the eastern United States, right along the edge, right along the coast of the Gulf here. And then we see it along the coast of California. Of course, California has particularly cold water. That actually helps somewhat. And then the North Pacific as well, very high productivity. But if you see dark blue oceans, that has little chlorophyll and they are biologically impoverished. So this area right here, this middle area in the north, actually it's more like the mid-Atlantic, this is relatively low in productivity. Why? Well, of course it is warmer, so oxygen is leaving the ocean here. But also, guys, it's very far from the coast. So this area that I've kind of marked with an X here, boy, this is really low productivity. Also, look at here, the Pacific. This is a very much of a dead zone where we just don't see a lot of productivity. You're so far from the coast where there's just not many nutrients. So it's kind of like a desert, if you will. And notice down here in some parts of the South Pacific and South Atlantic, even parts of the Indian Ocean, really low in productivity. But very high over here along the Middle East. Maybe these coastlines along, say, Kuwait and Iraq and Iran have lots of productivity in here. Off the coast of Africa, of course, and then there's a nice productive area here in the extreme southern Atlantic down here towards Antarctica. So just kind of look at that map. You can notice certain patterns. Kind of neat to study that. You know, you can see even some of these inland seas like the Black Sea and the Caspian Seas. They're very productive as well. So those are the patterns, things to be thinking about as we cover these marine ecosystems. All right, so the big thing with marine ecosystems is this thing called vertical stratification. Stratification literally means layering. So we have layers. We have, the upper layers where we have lots of sunlight. Sunlight is very penetrating. It goes down to about 20 meters to 100 meters is the range where it begins to get really dark. Once you get past 100 meters, there's not that much sunlight for photosynthesis. So most of your photosynthesis is going to occur in the upper 20 meters, but you're also going to get some photosynthesis between 20 and 100. And that area is what we call the photic zone. Some people call the photic zone only to 20 meters, like our textbook, but many other important biological textbooks I've taught out of note that 100 meters is the extent of the photic zone. So that's where your photosynthesis, pretty much all of your photosynthesis happens in the ocean here. Light and temperature both decrease with depth, and deep ocean species grow slower because it's very cold and because of the lack of productivity. There's just no photosynthesis deep in there. Temperature decreases happen very quickly. You can go from relatively warm surface waters to very cold water in like less than 1,000 meters. You can even get into really cold water even at 100 meters. So the temperature actually drops faster as you go deeper in the ocean than, say, here in the air. You all know that as we go up in elevation, the temperature typically drops, but that only drops at about 3.5 degrees every 1,000 feet you go up. Okay, so every 1,000 feet you climb, on average, you're going to drop about 3.5 degrees of temperature here on the on the terrestrial, in the air, in the terrestrial world. But in the aquatic world, the drop in temperature is even more rapid. And of course, the darkness kicks in even quicker too. So vertical stratification is very potent in these marine ecosystems. Cold water, again, to discuss that holds more oxygen than warm water. So productivity is often high in these cold oceans, like we just saw in the North Atlantic. And you can see that the vertical stratification is so influential that we actually have ocean systems classified by depth and location to the shore. So your benthic community is the bottom. So these are the organisms that live on the very bottom. You see a lot of crustaceans, a lot of mollusks down there. You'll also find some deep ocean fish species down there in the benthos. Make up the benthos community, which is the bottom. Pelagic, that's more of your open water column. So they are above the bottom. So that would be from the surface of the ocean all the way down toward the depths. So that's your pelagic, like a lot of tuna fish, things like sailfish are pelagic open ocean species. And then along the shore is what we call the littoral zone with all the sunlight there. It's a very productive area. Not only is there a lot of sunlight, there's also warmer waters, and you also have a lot of nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, lots of things coming off the land there. So it's a very productive area. You can see the layers of the ocean classified here. We have the epipelagic. That's just the very upper part of the pelagic. So notice the pelagic is this whole area here, all the way down to 4,000 meters of depth. That's super dark and super cold down there. Mesopelagic, you see a drop in temperature, and along with drop in temperature, it gets very dark, and there is basically no photosynthesis happening in the mesopelagic. So the epipelagic is the only place where you'll have photosynthesis. So yes, photosynthesis happens here, but once you get to meso and deeper, you don't have any photosynthetic activity. Bathypelagic, that's the very bottom of the pelagic, again, getting very dark and very cold. A lot of fish species will only go this deep. They can't go past this bathypelagic zone. Like a lot of shark species, like great whites, they're going to dive down into maybe a little bit of the bathypelagic, but they're going to stay mostly in the epipelagic. And actually, most great whites are going to be close to the shore. They're more of an inshore species. Abyssal, very, very deep, very dark, between 4,000 and 6,000. Not only that, but pressure becomes a big concern. A lot of organisms will be crushed under the pressure down here in the abyssal and the hadal zone. Very, very deep, 6,000 meters and deeper. A lot of the hadal zone is in oceanic trenches. Notice this thing called the continental shelf that extends off the continents. It's relatively shallow. It's typically epi and mesopelagic, and then there's this sudden sharp decline and drop in depth. We see this off the coast of North Carolina, for example, we have a very steep continental shelf just past the Outer Banks. Go out, say 50, 60 miles, you'll be pretty close to the edge of the continental shelf. Some parts of the Florida coast are very close to the continental shelf. It gets deep very quickly. And then there's other parts of the Atlantic where the continental shelf extends out further. It just depends on where you're at. Then along the shore, we have the littoral or intertidal zones. Littoral and intertidal overlap because the littoral is just the very light penetrating shallow areas along the coast. You could argue that, littoral is part of the epipelagic. Yes, you could say that, but littoral is specifically the part of the epipelagic that's along the coast. And then the intertidal zone is an area that's actually going to be not covered by water all the time. So intertidal during low tide will be above the water, and then at high tide will be below the water. And it has a very unique community here, which can withstand very harsh wave action, penetrating powerful sunlight, sometimes hot conditions, and then sometimes very cold conditions in the winter. They might even be covered by ice at times. So it's a very harsh area of extremes. And we have a lot of endemic species, just unique species here. Not necessarily super high in biodiversity, but we see a lot of unique species here. So let's go on down. So talking about the communities, surface all the way on down. So as we said before, the open ocean, metro, or your pelagic areas, particularly your meso and your from the mesopelagic all the way down to the bathypelagic, that's going to be mostly where we have your biological desert, where there's just not much productivity, except for those areas where nutrients are distributed by currents. So you might find currents bringing, for example, upwelling currents might occur in the open ocean, like off the coast of South America. As I mentioned before, that could increase your productivity in some of those areas. So you might have a little oasis in the desert. But then also you might just have a current that delivers a lot of sargassum, which is a seaweed or an algal species, and that's called the Sargasso Sea. So the Gulf Stream pumps up all of this algae floating along the surface. And so those algae, of course, are filled with nutrients. They provide habitat for crustaceans and mollusks and small fish, even eels, and they all float in the Sargasso Sea, in this sargassum weed, seaweed, or algae, and they get carried way out into the open ocean. So you have like a conveyor belt delivering all this wonderful biological productivity and photosynthetic communities, phytoplankton. So currents can really influence where those biological deserts stop and where those little biological desert oases begin. The deepest layers of the ocean, of course, the hadal zone, can actually contain a pretty rich community. Sometimes we think the hadal zone with the high pressures, cold temperatures, that there's just nothing down there. Actually, there's a really neat community of tube worms, mussels, etc. And how do they even get there? Well, there's microbes that support them. The microbes perform chemosynthesis. So it's basically the deep ocean version of photosynthesis. So instead of using sunlight to create chemical energy, they're going to be using chemical energy from thermal vents, special minerals like sulfur-containing minerals, and they'll use sulfur to get their energy along with the heat, because these thermal vents come out at temperatures of 350 degrees Celsius. Wow, guys, remember the boiling point of water is 100 degrees Celsius. Well, this is 350. The reason it's not boiling down there is the pressures are so high. So with intense pressures, you can actually get water that's 350 degrees Celsius that is not actually boiling. And these organisms can take those sulfur compounds, they can oxidize or reduce these compounds, and as they do so, they can release energy, and then that energy gives them the ability to build biomass along with those nutrients, and then that forms the producer community, and then the consumers are your tube worms and mussels, etc. So we have this really neat hadal zone. This was not even known until the late 70s. This is a picture of the hadal zone community. You can see the tube worms. You can see some mussels in here. There's even a completely albino crab down here. No need to have much pigmentation. It's so dark down here, you don't even have to be colored really. So these crabs down here, these crustaceans, are typically white. And again, the basis of this entire community down here in the hadal zone is the microbes, the bacteria, the archaeans that live down here that can convert that chemical energy through chemosynthesis. They're called chemoautotrophs, taking things like minerals, things that you would normally not see as potential food sources. They can use them for food, even inorganic nutrients. Wow, amazing stuff. Okay, moving now to the coastal zones. This is more important in terms of biodiversity. In the coastal zones, the communities, of course, we still have variation in depth, light, temperature, and nutrient concentration. But generally speaking, most of the coastal zones have plenty of light and typically warmer temperatures. Nutrients also tend to be higher here. One of the most important coastal zone communities are the coral reefs. What a coral reef really is, guys, is they're coral polyps. Okay, and what are those? Well, they're all what we call cnidarians. Cnidarians are animals. They're invertebrates. They have no backbone, and they're all in the group that includes jellyfish. So we've got jellyfish, like things like man-o'-wars, all these different groups that have stinging cells, and that's what characterizes the phylum Cnidaria. And within the Cnidaria group are the coral polyps. The polyps are mainly sessile, so they don't move as adults. Coral polyps might have a larval stage where they can swim when they're little, but then they settle down and they basically sit there in the ocean and filter feed. Also, they get energy from their algal symbiote. So we have coral polyps, which can't make their own food, living in a symbiotic relationship with the algae. The algae will use sunlight to perform photosynthesis, and they'll generate chemical energy, food essentially, and the polyps will feed on that, and they'll live in a close interdependent relationship. The algae get protection from the polyps get food from the algae. The polyps can also, like I said, some of them will filter feed. And so while they're growing, they'll produce calcium carbonate. Those are their skeletons. The calcium carbonate skeletons, the actual skeleton itself is not alive. So when coral polyps will die, you'll still have the reef sitting there, but it's a dead reef. So we have living coral reefs where we have active coral polyps growing and living with their symbiotic algae, but then we also have dead coral reefs. Can anybody tell me how you can tell the difference between dead and alive coral reefs? Yeah, okay, so the live coral reefs will be white. They're bleached. It's called coral bleaching. The reason coral bleaching occurs is when it gets warm. So when the water gets too warm, and we think global climate change is not a good thing for the coral reef community because we believe ocean temperatures will rise along with global temperatures rising. So global climate change resulting in sort of a global warming, then the algal symbiote jumps out of the coral polyp once it gets too warm. And when the algal symbiote jumps out of the coral polyp, the pigmentation is lost. You see, guys, the pigmentation, much of that in the coral reef is the algae. The algae have the pigments for photosynthesis, and that's what makes the coral reef so beautiful and colorful. And the coral polyps can pick up those pigments as well. And many of the organisms that feed on the algae will pick up those colors as well. So you'll go from this relatively colorful, beautiful system, ecosystem, to this bleached system where there's no algal symbionts, the coral polyps die, and now you just have the calcium carbonate rich skeletons left behind. And that reef can just sit there for a long, long time. Another threat to the coral reef is the fact that y'all know with global climate change, CO2 levels are increasing. All right, so as CO2 increases, I don't know if you guys knew this, but when CO2 encounters water, it automatically converts to carbonic acid. All right, so CO2, like you can actually blow carbon dioxide into water and you'll actually create carbonic acid. So as CO2 levels rise, the CO2 will go into the oceans and then that will cause the oceans to develop more carbonic acid. This causes the ocean's pH to drop. So we're actually acidifying the oceans. Acid rain doesn't help either. As the oceans become more acidic, the acid actually eats away at the calcium carbonate rich skeletons. So the coral reef can actually be chemically broken down by the lower pH of the ocean, by the ocean becoming more acidic. So that's yet another threat. So coral reefs are found in shallow water. They have to be because of the algal symbiote. They're threatened by things like trash, sewage, urban runoff, industrial waste, and introduced pathogens, of course, global warming, as I mentioned. Now, why would they be threatened by trash, sewage, and urban runoff, things like that, sediment even? Well, whenever we have human development, we typically have more sediment. So if you're developing an area, you expose it, rain hits, you get more erosion, sediment flows, and then when the sediment flows into water, it muddies the water. When the water gets muddier, you can't perform photosynthesis as well. So that's a major threat. Why would increased urban runoff be a problem? Well, if you get a lot of urban runoff, you get a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. When the nitrogen and phosphorus goes in the water, that causes algal bloom. So you get too many algae, and it actually sort of tarnishes the water. When you have too much algal growth, those algal species will get very thick, and they'll actually shade out the coral reef. Sewage does kind of the same thing. Sewage is carrying a lot of nutrients with it, nitrogen, phosphorus, other things. And so the sewage can actually increase the algal community floating above the coral reef, and that'll shade out the coral reef as well. Trash with toxins can actually kill them. Coral reefs are very sensitive to toxins since they're so directly exposed and to the water and have water flowing through them. Industrial waste, again, things like toxins can kill them that way. Pathogens that are being spread around by human beings, that's causing more problems too. And we also talked about the coral bleaching already. 1/3 of coral reefs have already been destroyed. Wow, that was according to a 2006 study. The third UNESCO conference on oceans, coasts, and islands in 2006, back then, reported that 1/3 of coral reefs have already been destroyed. So that's probably higher now. 60% of the remaining reefs will probably be dead by 2030. Many people believe that all coral reefs could be completely annihilated by 2050, thanks to the combination of global warming, the acidification of the ocean, and of course all the trash, sewage, industrial waste. Crazy, huh, guys? So we've got to really work hard, because if we lose coral reefs, we're going to lose a lot of species. Coral reefs may be the most biodiverse areas in the entire world. They actually may be more biodiverse than tropical rainforests. At least in the marine world, they are #1 along with estuaries in terms of biodiversity. So they're disproportionately important. They are a nursery for a lot of organisms as well. And they're economically important. So some of you listening to this online lecture, you're thinking, okay, I can see, why we need to save coral reefs for nature, but what about humans? What about us? Well, 1 square kilometer of coral reef will provide $1 million in tourist economy. So $1 million per square kilometer. But the cost of conserving the square kilometer is only $775. So by investing $775 per square kilometer of coral reef, we could be getting $1 million back per square kilometer. You see, guys, remember, one of the big themes in this course is that we can actually see human economies and biodiversity go hand in hand. It doesn't have to be, they don't have to be in conflict with each other. As I've always thought growing up, I always thought they were in conflict with each other. Sometimes they are, but not always. We got to think creatively outside the box. Here's a picture of a coral reef. You could see shallow seas, lots of sunlight coming in. You can see the beautiful white sands that result from coral reefs being nearby. Those calcium carbonate skeletons are just beautiful. And you could see, this is definitely a relatively warm area. Coral reefs are found between the 20 degrees Celsius isotherm. Okay, what does that mean? If you take the average temperature in January, all right, and then the average temperature in January is 20 degrees Celsius, the coral reefs will live between that 20 degrees Celsius zone. There's a line in the southern hemisphere and there's a line in the northern hemisphere. The coral reefs are all found in between there. So they basically are found roughly, guys, between 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south, okay, latitude. So 30 degrees north to 30 degrees south latitude with a few exceptions, and so they're mainly along the equator. Mangroves, we haven't talked about those too much, but you can see that mangroves are salt-tolerant trees. And these mangrove swamps create really nice nursery areas. So we have baby fish, lots of baby fish eggs being laid here. Lots of baby fish are being raised here. Crustaceans, we have mollusks. We also see a lot of timber production. So people living along the coast, this may be their only source of fuel wood. So they chop these mangrove trees down to get firewood, to keep themselves warm for cooking. Lots of different important things. But mangrove swamps are only found along tropical and subtropical areas. And y'all see their root system? See how it just goes all over the place? Well, all those nooks and crannies are nice hiding places for organisms to live. And what else do you think those roots do? Yeah, they protect the coastlines from erosion. So you get a major hurricane, tropical storm, just regular wave action, those roots will help keep that coastline intact, which is a good economic benefit, right? Want to keep those coastlines intact so the homes behind them aren't destroyed. Estuaries and salt marshes, what in the world are those? Well, estuary is simply where fresh water encounters salt water in a bay. So an estuary is typically a bay where you have a river carrying fresh water coming down into a saltwater area like the Chesapeake Bay, which is the largest estuary in the United States. It's also the most productive estuary in the United States. And oftentimes in an estuary, you will also have a salt marsh. Salt marsh is just where we have salt water, and then we have grasses like Spartina grass, cord grass, various grasses that live in this salt water, but no trees. So a marsh is basically a wetland that has no trees. You can see in the distance there's some trees. Well, that's where the marsh ends. That's where the forest begins. All right, guys, and it's very productive down here. We have some eel grass underneath the water, salt grass or sea grass found down underneath the water. Really very productive. Again, lots of baby fish being born here, a major nursery for many of our fish that we enjoy eating. Again, a very important economic benefit, keeping these areas intact. This is a tide pool. You can see lots of sea stars. You see some corals, or you see some sea anemones, different things here. Very unique. They have to be able to handle that intense wave action. There's also some sea urchins. So very, very endemic, unique species here, not quite as high in biodiversity. Talk more about mangroves. Again, these are the trees that grow in those saltwater areas along tropical and subtropical coastlines. We talked about how they stabilize the shoreline with those roots. Great nurseries for fish and shrimp and crabs, and they can be cut for timber. So the mangrove swamps are mainly threatened in places like Java and Indonesia, where most of the coastline has been deforested. The mangroves have been cut extensively. Sometimes they're not just cut for timber. Sometimes mangroves are cut so that they can create little pools for raising commercial species. So sometimes they'll actually clear a mangrove swamp and then convert it to aquaculture. So they'll clear cut those mangrove swamps for fish farming. Ironically, they'd be better off not even messing with it though. Let the mangrove swamp do the farming for you rather than converting it. So that can be a problem. Tidal environments. So we mentioned these a little bit before. Again, the estuaries, bays or semi-enclosed bodies of brackish water, whereas the salt and the freshwater mix. They're very productive because you have lots of nutrients coming in from the freshwater entering. They're also really biodiverse because you have both fresh and saltwater species living there. You find lots of sunlight as well, and the water temperature is often warm. Salt marshes course, they are found as part of the estuary, usually along the sides. Again, these are your coastal wetlands. They're flooded regularly by seawater through high and low tides. Sometimes storms will bring in extra water as well. But salt marshes, of course, are very nutrient rich and biologically diverse as part of the estuary ecosystem. In fact, 2/3 of your marine fish and shellfish rely on them for spawning and development. Wow. Now, why is that? Why do all these marine fish that live way out in the ocean have to come to the salt marshes and the estuaries to lay their eggs? Why can't they lay their eggs out in the open ocean? Well, let's think about that. Do fish eggs float normally? No, they normally sink. So if you're in the open ocean, you lay your eggs out there, your eggs will sink down to the bottom of the ocean where it's cold, where the pressure is high, and where there's no light. They're going to die. So these marine fish, even the pelagic ones, must come in, these open ocean species must come in, lay their eggs in these shallow areas, and then return back to the open ocean. Of course, they're threatened by sewage from coastal cities, also agricultural runoff. So the sewage and the agricultural runoff with the nitrogen and phosphorus loads are going to cause algal blooms. We get more sediment. We get more algal blooms. The algal blooms shade out those species down below, and things like eelgrass and your saltgrass or your seagrass, all those things get shaded out and they die, and that causes the entire ecosystem to collapse. This is exactly what's going on with the Chesapeake Bay. And we looked at an article earlier in one of these online lectures where I mentioned how Pennsylvania is one of the states that really needs to catch up. Pennsylvania is such a heavy agricultural state. Pennsylvania is probably the biggest contributor to the Chesapeake Bay's problems right now. Remember, Pennsylvania does not border the Chesapeake Bay. They're found upstream. So they may not feel that, they may not sense it because it's happening far away from them, or at least several, say, tens of miles away from them, at least say 50 miles anyway. So states like Maryland are very sensitive because Maryland surrounds the Chesapeake Bay, but people up in Pennsylvania and even New York State have a lot of runoff that winds up in the Chesapeake Bay. So it's a multi-state problem. Each state has to take responsibility. And that article we looked at was Pennsylvania trying to, get with a program and reduce that runoff. In fact, guys, there are 200 areas across the world where we have complete what we call dead zones. These dead zones are areas where nutrient levels are so high that algal species have just crowded out areas. They've not only shaded areas out, all the algae can do that, but they've also take away oxygen. Now, let me explain that, because people are like, man, what? Algae, wouldn't they bring oxygen to the aquatic ecosystem? Well, because algae do produce oxygen, right? They sure do, as they perform photosynthesis. So when it's sunny, the algae give us plenty of oxygen. But what happens on that first cloudy, chilly day in fall, or those cloudy, sort of dreary days any time of year? Well, at that time, the algae will not perform photosynthesis. Instead, they'll perform respiration, and they'll take away oxygen. You see? So algae will give you oxygen, but then during those cloudy days or even at night, you'll see the algae will actually suck an area clean of oxygen. So that's why nutrients are such a problem. It seems like it would be a good thing to have more nutrients in places like the Chesapeake Bay. No, too many nutrients, too many algae, not enough oxygen, and even some shading out occurs. Tide pools, these are neat depressions and rocky shorelines. Great place for kids to walk around and sample biodiversity. As a child, I used to love walking around some of the rocky shorelines up toward the northeast. We don't really have rocky shorelines down here, but along Maine, coast of Maine, and the coast of New Hampshire on down to Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and almost down to New York a little bit, you'll see some rocky shorelines off the coast of New York. And but anyway, they're flooded at high tide. They retain some water at low tide. Wave action is very intense here, so you don't have a lot of plant growth. The animals can hang in there. They have special hold fasts. Holdfast are very tough materials that anchor them down so they can handle that tidal action. One thing that's nice about tide pools is they're very oxygen rich. When the wave action is happening, you see lots of oxygen there, but you also see extreme temperatures. So it can get really hot as they're being beat down by the sun in the summer, maybe 90 to 100 degrees, but then in the winter it can get really cold. You know, the ocean moderates temperatures, but in these tidal zones you don't have as much moderation because you're not being completely submerged by the water all the time. So many species adapted to the harsh conditions live here. They have less competition here, but boy, it's harsh. Barrier islands, more important to us. In the Outer Banks of North Carolina, we have extensive barrier islands. This picture here is a picture of Assateague Island, which is off the coast of Virginia and Maryland. This is an island I've been to before. They have a horse population out here from horses that there was a shipwreck out here, and then the horses swam to the Assateague Island. They've lived here for hundreds of years. They've even become sort of part of the community here. But you can see that the barrier islands are vulnerable. Do you see that, guys? They're not really, high in elevation. They're maybe 10, 20 feet at the highest at some of the higher sand dunes. I mean, I suppose you could have a really high sand dune that might be more like 50 to 100 feet, like you have around Kitty Hawk. But they're vulnerable because all it takes is a big storm with some storm surge, and the entire barrier island will go underneath the water. The barrier island will be buried with water. You can have a 20-foot storm surge that could easily go over the entire barrier island, plus waves, right? So you got a 20-foot storm surge, and then you get 10, 20-foot waves on top of that. Well, gosh, that's going to go right over this thing. So barrier islands are constantly being shaped and sculpted by storms. It might look like this now, but this barrier island may have a totally different shape later. And you might even have a channel form right here. So that bay here could be connected to the ocean directly through the action of waves. Can y'all see any of the disturbance in this picture? Yeah, there's some disturbance. Okay, so you see this road right here. So there's a road here. There's also a road that was formed here, maybe right here as well. So people with their dune buggies, sometimes it's law enforcement, beach patrol, people driving along here in motorized vehicles. Those little spots here, these little roads, make the barrier island really vulnerable to erosion. So that's one of the major threats. People actually like building houses on barrier islands. Not a good idea. Can you imagine the homeowners insurance here? So people build homes here. The homes are destroyed regularly by storms, and then they just rebuild again. So that's one of the major threats. People just like to develop them because they're relatively natural. You got a beach house, not good. So 20% of barrier islands have been developed in the U.S. They should not be built on. The storms will typically destroy those buildings, even those that are on stilts. Hurricane Sandy did a number on a lot of our barrier islands. Barrier islands provide wonderful service to us. So let's go back to the economy. So you're saying, oh, Mr. Spath, don't develop barrier islands? That's going to hurt the economy. Well, you know what hurts the economy even more? When the barrier islands fail to do their job, which is to protect the shoreline. So the barrier island is a major shield from wave action coming in. So barrier islands have that major role, and it's wonderful because they lie parallel to the ocean coast. They lie parallel to the shore, so they provide a really nice shield. And so lots of reasons why we should not develop them, but you'll find at the Outer Banks many of our barrier islands have been developed, and they're just asking for trouble, aren't they, guys? This is a picture from Hurricane Sandy. This is a barrier island further north. You can see the snow. Remember, Hurricane Sandy was crazy. It rained and it was like a hurricane, but then it actually produced snow too. Even in our southern Appalachians, we had snow down here, and this place just got nailed. You could see the extensive erosion. Now these homes are right on the edge of a cliff. Normally there would have been a nice long beach here, and that's what they enjoyed for some time. But these homes are all vulnerable. Many of them have already been rebuilt, and yep, they'll succumb again to more wave action in the next storm. There will be another Sandy one day, right, guys? It's just inevitable. And all this salt water coming in and damaging these homes and seeping down into the groundwater. You could just see how that could be such a problem. All right, let's switch now to the freshwater ecosystems. This is something, of course, you'll encounter a lot more here in this part of the state. Freshwater lakes, just like oceans, they also have distinct vertical zones. The freshwater lakes, though, compared to the ocean, are more influenced by the surrounding land because they're completely surrounded by the land, whereas the ocean only has the land on sides. You could argue the ocean's surrounded by land, but really it's more like the land is surrounded by ocean, right? The land is only about a quarter of the surface of the earth. So lakes are particularly surrounded and more influenced by what's happening around them. So lakes will be more influenced by farmlands and local temperature, geography, and things than, say, the ocean. They have the epilimnion. This is that warmer upper layer where there's the photic zone where you have lots of photosynthesis. So you'll find the phytoplankton here in the epilimnion, very much like the epipelagic zone in the oceans. And then you have the hypolimnion, which is where we have that colder water. Along with colder water, we have usually low oxygen. I know you're thinking, Mr. Spath, I thought you said that cold water holds more oxygen. It does, but when you're deep down, you're so far from the surface, you typically don't have a lot of oxygen at the bottom of the lake. But you do have a lot of nutrients. There's a lot of nutrients down there in the hypolimnion. In fact, sometimes we'll try to get nutrients from the hypolimnion to come up to the epilimnion. And this happens in the fall through something called lake turnover. So in the fall, colder air is going to start coming in. It's going to cool the surface waters. The surface waters become more dense and they sink, and that creates a convection current. You get this sort of round vertical convection current happening in lake turnover. And that brings those cool nutrient-rich waters of the hypolimnion up to the epilimnion, and where the nutrients and the light come together, magic happens. Lots of biological productivity occurs. The thermocline is the area in between. This is that temperature transition zone that separates warm upper and deeper colder layers. The thermocline can be very narrow at times. It can be very thick. It can even be lost. Sometimes you almost have no transition zone, and that's not good. The thermocline is where a lot of species will hang out. Why? Well, okay, let's go ahead and draw this out. So we've got the, say, the epilimnion here, and then we have the hypolimnion down here. So here's the hypolimnion, here's the epilimnion, and then here is the thermocline. All right, and so what will happen is in the summer, the epilimnion gets really warm. And since it gets so warm, there's not much oxygen, okay? So not a whole lot of oxygen in the epilimnion, not a lot of oxygen down here in the hypolimnion, so the fish will get stuck in the thermocline. And so you look at your fish finder and you find all these fish hanging out here in the thermocline, and that's where you want to fish. The fish can temporarily go into the epilimnion, but they'll start to suffocate and they'll come back down to the thermocline. Same thing here. They'll go down the hypolimnion for a while, lack of oxygen, they'll move back up into the thermocline. In the fall, you'll see more mixing of these layers, and that's actually a good thing. All right, guys, so here's the layers of the lake. There's your epilimnion. Again, that's where your phytoplankton are, lots of productivity. This is part of your littoral zone where there's plenty of sunlight. Thermocline, that's that transition. There's that cooler, nutrient-rich hypolimnion, and then they also have a benthos community with lots of worms and mollusks like snails, freshwater snails, and things down here. Okay, guys, so that's the layers of a deep lake. Shallow lake, you'll start to lose your hypolimnion, and you'll have just maybe even just an epilimnion towards the end of the lake's life. Notice that the terrestrial ecosystems really influence the lake since it's surrounded by a terrestrial ecosystem. So you have the inorganic materials flowing in. Those would be things like a lot of your fertilizers, the organic materials, by the way, detergents. So both detergents and fertilizers will come in from the land. Also some minerals coming off of rocks. Organic materials, say like things like some of the other more natural organic fertilizers, manure, sewage, dead plant and animal material comes in, agricultural influx, of course, all those things, even pesticides, lots of sunlight, heat's going to be leaving, aquatic plants and animals will use ultimately the sun's energy to stay alive, and then all this organic and inorganic material will go downstream to everybody else. Okay, guys, including some pollution. All right, guys, so that's a good little perspective there on those freshwater ecosystems. Now we're going to kind of switch our focus a little bit to wetlands, which are still freshwater ecosystems. And let's talk first about how we define them. So excuse me, a wetland is simply a land surface that is saturated or covered with water for at least part of the year. So some wetlands may only be covered by water for maybe one season, maybe just a few months in the spring. Others may be covered for most of the year, but they have to be at least saturated or covered with water for at least part of the year. And you can see there's a lot of variation with wetlands. Swamps simply are wetlands with trees. If you don't have any trees, it's a marsh. You can get freshwater or saltwater marshes. And then we have bogs and fens. Now, the swamps and marshes are really biologically productive and very diverse because of the sunlight, the shallower waters. You've got nutrients typically here pretty high, so you get a lot of productivity and biodiversity here. However, bogs and fens don't have as much. Why? Well, bogs and fens typically have very low pH. They are very acidic. Why are they so acidic? Well, they're acidic because you have all this plant matter that's built up and is slowly decaying. So waterlogged soils that tend to accumulate peat. Peat is a type of moss. It builds up here in these bogs and fens, becomes very thick, and it causes its breakdown, and its presence causes the pH to be low. In fact, the pH can be so low in these bogs and fens that it actually destroys bacteria, and those bacteria are gone, so you have very low decomposition. You can actually find dead bodies, human bodies, and dead animals sometimes in bogs and fens that are relatively preserved. They actually pulled out a person that had been alive, I think it was like a Neanderthal or someone around the Neanderthal period almost 30,000 years ago, or several thousand years ago, and it was pulled out of a bog and the body wasn't even that bad. You think the acids would break it down, but the acids actually preserve the body, kind of like pickling. You take a pickle, put in that vinegar, and that cucumber, put in that vinegar, it preserves it. So low pH acidic things can preserve things. Bogs are fed by precipitation, so just water flowing down into the bog keeps the bog going, whereas fens are fed from groundwater, and the groundwater has almost no oxygen. Nutrient poor, so we don't see a lot of nutrients thanks to the fact that there's low pH. That's part of the reason that there are very few nutrients here. Very low productivity because of the low pH and the low nutrients. But you find a lot of unusual species like sundews and Venus flytraps. In fact, Venus flytraps are more diverse here in North Carolina than any other place. So if you are into Venus flytraps and what we call carnivorous plants, Eastern North Carolina is the place to go, especially in these bogs and fens and marshes and swamps. You'll find them there, but particularly in the bogs and fens. Why are Venus flytraps and sundews, these carnivorous plants, why are they found in bogs and fens? Well, because it's nutrient poor, these plants need insects to get their phosphorus and things like nitrogen. So we have low nitrogen, low phosphorus, and so these Venus flytraps and sundews, they're actually eating, if you will, these flies, these insects, for nitrogen and phosphorus. Not for food, really, because they do perform photosynthesis. So a Venus flytrap is actually making its own food. So think of the flies, the insects, as vitamins. That's their daily vitamin, right? All right. So water is usually shallow enough to allow full sunlight. So the majority of wetlands have very high productivity and, of course, biodiversity and lots of biomass production. And then what do they actually do for us? Well, wetlands, they actually trap and filter water. So after water has flowed through a swamp, a marsh, a bog, or a fen, that water is usually much cleaner. It actually stores runoff too, which prevents flooding. So you get sort of water storage here. So it's like a big sponge. Think of a wetland as a sponge. So the water lands, instead of just running off and flooding, the water is stored, it's absorbed, and then the wetland slowly releases that water so that you actually have more water during periods of drought. Like a wet sponge, it continues to leak even during those dry periods, so you have a more reliable source of water when you have wetlands. Also, then the wetlands prevent flooding because they absorb everything, just like a good sponge would do. So that's some of the neat things that wetlands provide. They're also major nurseries. So we have a lot of, we mentioned that before, lots of baby fish, crustaceans, and a lot of shorebirds. Lots of endangered species are dependent on wetlands. Wetlands occupy less than 5% of the land of the U.S. At one time, wetlands occupied more than 10%. Now we're down to less than 5% of the land. Yet, 1/3 of all endangered species spend at least part of their lives in wetlands. 1/3 do. So very, very key. Conservation is very important, again, because of the rich biodiversity. They're breeding grounds for birds. Many of your migratory birds are dependent on them. And again, 1/3 of endangered species spend at least part of their life cycle is dependent on wetlands. Yet they only occupy about 5%, right, of our land. They may gradually convert to terrestrial communities through succession. So over time, a wetland will eventually start to be filled by sediment and over naturally occurring loads, and of course, sometimes the erosion is artificial. So we'll have natural erosion will eventually fill a wetland in, but we'll also see that people will develop, like say buildings, parking lots, development will occur, and you'll have increased erosion, and that will fill the wetland even faster. Most wetlands were intentionally filled in, guys. We were intentionally filling wetlands up for agricultural purposes. So, for example, 99% of the wetlands in Iowa are gone. And why do you think Iowa? Why does Iowa only have 1% of their remaining wetlands? Yeah, because Iowa is part of the Corn Belt, right? Major agricultural area. So you can see here, there's the swamp there with the trees. You can see the marsh here without trees, and then a coastal salt marsh here. And this is probably a freshwater marsh. Yeah, that's a freshwater marsh here in the middle. All right, guys, let's go now to human disturbance, the last topic, talking about how humans have sort of impacted some of these biomes. And some biomes we've been impacted more than others. For example, temperate broadleaf or temperate deciduous forests are 81.9% human dominated, whereas the tundra is only 0.3% human dominated. So some biomes have been much more disturbed than others. Humans preempt about 40% of net terrestrial primary productivity. So we're affecting all that, nearly half of terrestrial primary productivity. We convert much habitat to human use, and that is the #1 cause of biodiversity loss, is habitat loss, where we take habitat, we convert it to human use, no longer is it a natural habitat. The #2 reason, anybody remember? #2 reason for biodiversity loss? Exotic invasive species. Temperate deciduous forests are the most completely human-dominated. Tundra and Arctic deserts are the least. And there's a nice table that will rank them for you. So it's temperate broadleaf forests, chaparral. You remember the chaparral? That's the Mediterranean area where we have a lot of shrubs, wet in the winter, dry in the summer, fire dependent. Temperate grasslands are the next because of all the farming. Temperate rainforests, like the Pacific Northwest, would be the next. Then we have tropical dry forests, mixed mountain systems. Finally, we get to islands, cold deserts, not highly human occupied. Then we get to warm or hot deserts. Then we get down to tropical rainforests, then tropical grasslands, temperate coniferous forests. So temperate coniferous forests like your taiga, like much of Canada and Siberia, only 11 or 12% human dominated, and then tundras at the very bottom. Half of all original wetlands in the U.S. have been degraded over the past 250 years. So we've gone from over 10% now we're down to less than 5% of our wetlands. Again, that's mostly because of farming, sometimes simply filling in just for development. Most people don't look at a swamp and think of it as a nice place. You just don't see that, especially in older generations. But now we're getting to appreciate this more and more. Here is a nice map showing you, it's not really a nice map in the sense that it's not pleasant news, but is certainly a true thing. Let me take a pause just for a second. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Just had a phone call come in. That happens sometimes when I'm doing these online lectures. So this map, again, is not positive news. This is just a map of human disturbance where you can see all the areas in purple are domesticated lands. So look at all that purple here in the United States. Where is that? What's going on here? So most of this purple area in the United States is the corn belt, is the breadbasket of the United States. Well, our corn, wheat, soybean, many things are grown in this area, so much of it's been human dominated. Notice we do have some forest here in the east. The Appalachians prevent some of the development. We do have some nice coastal areas that have remained relatively forested. Maine is the most forested state in the United States. So Maine is #1. And you can see part of the reason is just because it's so cold up there and not as many people want to live up there, and you're far away from a lot of the large cities. You can see desert, tundra, woodland, lots of tundra and woodland. So we have large areas of these boreal forests in Siberia, Northern Europe, and Canada. So that's where we have a lot of forest. Tropical rainforest, lots of areas in South America, Central Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. So this gives you at least an idea of where human disturbance is high. But is the temperate broadleaf forest where human disturbance is highest? And where is that temperate deciduous forest? Well, basically it's Europe, eastern United States, and southwest China. These are areas would be the most human dominated, though they do have some nice little patches of forest in there. All right, guys, let's go ahead and move down to the very last slide, and then we'll talk about the lab. So here is that table showing you where areas are very highly human dominated to areas that are very sparsely dominated. A lot of this has to do with comfort. You know, people just don't want to live in temperate coniferous forests because it's cold. You know, 3 months out of the year, June, July, and August are pretty nice, but the rest of the year can be quite cold. You can start getting snow in late September and October, and it can snow all the way through May, sometimes even early June. So just a lot of folks not living here. Of course, if a lot of people don't want to live there, the economy doesn't typically do as well. There's fewer cities, fewer jobs, so people don't live there. Temperate broadleaf are very desirable, and so is the chaparral. It's just a very nice climate, and people enjoy their 4 seasons, so we tend to like to live here. And of course, that's where our big cities have developed, and that's going to, of course, perpetuate things because that's where the jobs are, so people want to move there. Temperate grasslands, their big thing was, of course, the agriculture. That's why they're so high. Okay, guys, well, we're going to go ahead and get into the lab, and I hope you guys have learned some things about the world. Certainly interesting geography, interesting perspectives on biodiversity and human disturbance across the world. You'll find, too, before I wrap this part up, places like the tundra and Arctic desert and of course, the hot deserts, like here, they're kind of low in terms of human domination, but they're really vulnerable, guys, because they don't recover from disturbance very quickly. What's nice about tropical grasslands is they can recover a little quicker, and certainly tropical rainforests can recover rather quickly. But deserts, hot deserts, and the tundra really recover very slowly because their productivity is so low because of lack of water or just simply plain cold. All right, guys, well, let's go ahead now and get into the lab. Let's go ahead and take a peek at this lab here. It's called the Biome Survival Lab. It's kind of a creative way to learn about biomes. So you're going to go to the Biome Survival Lab website. You can work in groups. You're going to do parts 1 and 2, but not 3. And you're going to do the conclusion questions, except questions 5 through 7. So you're going to do questions 1 through 4. So let's go ahead and check it out. Let's go ahead and take a little visit here to the Biome Survival Lab. And let's go ahead and let it open. You can see it's popping up here. And you can see it just takes you to this website. And so what's going to happen is you're going to be in a plane crash. Yeah, so your plane is going to crash in the biome of your choice. You get to pick whichever biome you would like to survive in. Doesn't necessarily have to be the easiest. Just pick a biome that you're just interested in. And it's going to be about 150 kilometers from the nearest town. So you can see the pilot has been killed, but you and one other passenger have survived. Notice it's January, and the temperature is average for that time of year. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about where you're going to crash. And everyone is going to survive, so that's good news. You will get through this thing. And we have some supplies that you were able to confiscate. So you're going to have to decide where you landed, so what biome, and then what is the area like. Then you're going to list all the available items in your biome. So you need to look and research a little bit about your biome and find out what natural resources are available in that biome that you can survive on. But you're also going to get to survive on some of these items here. However, you can only choose a certain number. You can only pick 5 items from the plane crash. So keep in mind your biome. What is your biome like? And if you, for example, crash in a desert, then you probably would like to have some water, right? You definitely would want to have the 1 gallon of drinkable water. So use some common sense, think through, understand your biome, and pick just 5 items from this list. But you also get to list out all of your natural resources that are found in the biome, and then we'll have lots of natural resources. So consider those natural resources. You definitely want to list out your 5 items. List your items here. So you're going to list out your 5 items here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You could do this on a separate document. This does not have to be done here. You can print this out if you wanted to and then write on it and take a picture of it. There's different ways to do this, but you can just simply write out number 3, part 1, and then just list out the 5. And one thing I'm really going to look at is justify why you chose those 5 items. So once you pick those 5 items from the plane crash, talk about why you picked those 5, and of course in relation to the fact that you're in a particular biome. You want to answer this question: what is the average temperature in your biome during the month of January, and what season would that be? Keep that in mind because it might be in the southern hemisphere, so that might not be winter. Don't have to worry about this compass part. You're going to go on down to the conclusion questions. You're going to answer these 4. So what is the most difficult situation to overcome in your biome? Answers will vary, right, depending on which biome you're in. If you were to crash in another biome, what would that have changed your recovered items? But make sure you answer why or why not. So a lot of times people say yes or they say no, but definitely elaborate. Tell me why or why not that you have changed those recovered items. Then you want to discuss which land-based biome you feel would be the most difficult to survive in. Make sure you discuss why. So which one would be the worst to crash into in, say, January? And then which land-based biome do you feel would be the easiest to survive in January, and then why? So discuss that. And then you don't have to worry about numbers 5 and 6 or 7. So you're really just answering those 4 there. So it's not too bad of a lab. It's supposed to be kind of fun. People tend to like it after watching all those survival reality shows, right? Some of you guys are kind of maybe interested in that kind of thing. I know many people love Survivor, or that whatever that show is called. Gosh, you can tell I didn't watch it much. Anyway, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to email me at mspath@wpcc.edu. You can also meet with me during office hours. Of course, I will always be checking my email 7 days a week. And just let me know if I can help you with anything. And I hope you have a great day.